Part 15. A long 6 months. It took a further month to clear up the mess that had been created by John Waters. Apparently the fraud was started to fund a lavish lifestyle, which included a penchant for cocaine. The drugs business started later, as the fraudsters' greed grew and the suppliers had found another method to transport their wares. Angela stepped into the arrivals at Logan Airport in Boston. Throughout the flight she wondered whether she'd made the right decision. In her heart she knew her relationship with James would never work unless she changed. Nevertheless, she felt wrong that she hadn't told James she was leaving to his face. Maybe the note she had left for him was inadequate. He would have asked too many questions, and that was a pressure she could never cope with. She had phoned James's old friend before boarding, and, as promised, he stood waiting for her outside arrivals. Had she done the right thing in using James's friend? She'd reasoned that any friend of James's would be a good person. Certainly he was not what she expected. Short, unathletic, and balding. She imagined him to fit in James's mould. He looked kind, though, she thought. She arrived at her new temporary residence in the heart of Boston, not knowing how long she'd be staying. She was full of hope and a little excited that this may be the start of a new life. It was 3 p.m. Only 4 more hours and he would pick her up for dinner. Suddenly, 4 hours seemed like a lifetime. When he finally arrived, Angela's excitement had all but disappeared. She'd hunted for an alcoholic drink to no avail. Eventually she'd resolved to stay in the apartment, but this was purely due to her nervousness with her new surroundings. If this were a hotel, she would have made her way to the bar. William arrived at Angela's new apartment 15 minutes early. Immediately he noticed the change in Angela. It concerned him that she had changed so profoundly in a relatively short time, but he maintained an ignorance of her condition and assumed she was ready for the evening by holding open the door for her to pass through. Angela duly obliged, and, feeling instantly more relaxed by his presence, picked up her coat and handbag, smiling as she passed by his outstretched arm. The evening went well. Angela liked her newfound friend. Whilst physically he was nothing like she expected, mentally he was witty and entertaining. She knew he was gauging her, but she didn't mind. At the end of the evening, William asked Angela whether she would prefer to stay with him for a day or two, rather than be on her own. Angela accepted the offer politely, endeavouring to show casualness without appearing rude. Underneath her cool exterior, she jumped for joy at the offer, as she dreaded the thought of being alone. It was never the daytime that bothered her, it was the long nights, when she questioned her whole being time and time again, until the drugs or alcohol took over and she could forget. William's live-in partner, Scotty, was indeed a Scotsman, and very camp. Angela liked him immediately. He was extremely witty and very zany. Scotty took care of everything to do with the household and was something of a whiz in the kitchen. It would be a month before Angela and William agreed that she should try a couple of nights on her own in a new apartment. William assured her that if needed, he was only a call away should the need arise. With a fair degree of uncertainty, Angela settled down with her sketch pad that night and began drawing.
Start giving to yourself all you wish for someone else. Start living every day. All your dreams are just a breath away.
Somehow, her work had been largely forgotten during her stay with William. It had crossed her mind a few times to pen some of her ideas, but Boston had proved to be stimulating enough on its own. Her ideas came quickly, and when she next glanced at the time it was 2 a.m. She could easily have carried on, but with a degree of discipline she showered and climbed into bed, switching on the television as she did so. She smiled as she thought of James and blew an imaginary kiss at a picture of him on her mobile phone, something of a habit since arriving in Boston. Angela awoke at 9 a.m. The television was still on, and she had no recollection of settling down to sleep. She felt great. There was no doubt in her mind this was the beginning. William encouraged her, but tempered her initial euphoria. Over the next 3 months it became clear that despite some ups and downs, Angela had indeed made enormous strides. She would stay with William and Scotty almost every weekend, which provided the levelling influence she needed. Every day, William would spend an hour with Angela talking about her life, both past and present. Mostly this would take place formally in his consulting room. Slowly, step by step, Angela began to like herself. She began to recognise her demons and her own achievements, and began to realise that she could be loved and that she too could love and learn to trust. She started to believe in herself. It would take just over 5 months before Angela decided to visit her parents. She had a simple plan: forgiveness. William smiled when Angela announced her plans. "You've done it. I really think you've done it," he said quietly. "I think I have," and added, "but not without your help," and kissed William on his cheek. "No, Angela, it's all down to you. I'm merely your sounding board. In anticipation of this day, I've taken the liberty of contacting a colleague of mine in LA and telling him that you might be in contact," and added hastily, "Naturally, I'm always at your disposal. Thanks for everything. I'm going to miss both of you so much." She kissed both men, a tear in her eye, and Scotty's too. "Bye. We love you," called out Scotty as Angela's cab pulled away. "Love you too. See you soon," called back Angela, waving as her cab pulled away. Angela arrived in New York and booked into the Mandarin Oriental for 1 night. She took a room with a Central Park view. She had no intention of staying longer than she needed, and knew she had to get back to Los Angeles. She called her mother from her room and made arrangements to see her parents at 7 p.m. Her mother had said she was busy and that tomorrow would be more convenient, but Angela insisted. Her mother was irritated, but Angela cut the conversation short with, "See you at 7. The walk to Upper East Side was about 1.5 miles through the park, and Angela used the walk to visualise her impending meeting. She stood outside the imposing residence, took a deep breath, and rang the doorbell. "Miss Holman," said Mary, smiling curtly. "Good evening, Mary. I trust you're well," said Angela, not waiting for a response as she walked past the housekeeper. Angela took off her jacket and handed it to Mary. "Where's my mother?" "Upstairs in the drawing room," replied Mary, adding, "She's busy right now." "Probably arranging the hairdresser," murmured Angela. "Pardon?" said Mary. Angela ignored her and walked into the lift. She fixed a stare at the housekeeper as the doors closed. Angela entered the drawing room to find her mother on the phone. "I have to go now. Angela's arrived." "Yes, completely out of the blue. She's thrown us a bit. See you tomorrow." She looked up at Angela. "Angela, darling, you've put on weight." Angela walked across to her mother and pecked her on the cheek. "So have you, mother," she replied. "I weigh myself every day, and I'm only 3 pounds heavier than the day your father and I married." Angela said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes and irritated her mother, who chose not to pursue the subject. "So what have you been up to? It must be almost a year since we last saw you," said her mother. 2.5 years, replied Angela, without waiting for a response. "I won some design awards." However, before she continued, her mother interjected, "And have you found yourself a man?" This was a barbed question, as her mother was well aware of Angela's inability to have a stable relationship. "Yes, he's an accountant," replied Angela. "I always find them so intensely boring." "Yes, little grey men," said her mother. "This one isn't boring at all, and I shall marry him," said Angela, outwardly confident. "Good, good. I'm sure you're well suited." Angela's mother had felt somewhat unnerved by Angela's confidence. Normally, Angela would have been looking down at her feet by now, and yet her daughter was fixated upon her mother's eyes. Angela's father arrived at that moment. "Angela, your mother said you were coming. Do you need money?" "No, father, I haven't needed money from you for several years now, or had you not noticed?" And without waiting for a reply, "I've come here to tell you I forgive you." "Forgive us for what?" her mother asked incredulously. "I forgive you for allowing father's best friend for trying to rape me. I forgive you for leaving me at boarding school after all the other girls had been collected by their parents, not once, not twice, but on 3 separate occasions. The school had to phone you to find out where you were. How do you think that made me feel? I forgive you for throwing all my toys from the bedroom window onto the street below because I spoke when I wasn't supposed to. Yes, mother, I know what you're going to say, but I was 5 years old. I forgive you for putting everything in your lives before me." "We gave you everything," retorted her father angrily. "I guess by that remark you're referring to money. Father, money means nothing when all a child needs is the love of a parent. In that respect, I can say that neither of you have shown me an ounce of love or attention since the day I was born." "You ungrateful hussy," said her mother, aghast at the outburst. "Mother, all I have ever heard from you is how I ruined your figure by giving birth to me, and I can clearly see how I've done that. I'll send you an invitation to my wedding, but don't worry if you're too busy. You won't be missed. I'm going now. If you need me, I'll be in LA." With that, Angela turned and walked casually towards the staircase. "Angela!" called her father. "I didn't know." He broke off and looked towards his wife as if looking for help. "She's an ungrateful devil, Michael." "Shut up, Elizabeth. Can't you think of anything constructive to say at all?"
Something's happening to her tonight. She's found love, everything's alright. Something's happening to her tonight. She's found love, everything's alright. You never know what's waiting there, about to change your life. Hold on to all your dreams, never let them die.
Angela could still hear her father's voice raised above that of her mother's as she opened the front door and left the house. She felt good. She felt empowered. She felt a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She felt this was a new world. She thought of James. "God, I hope he'll marry me," she mused. Angela walked back to the Mandarin. She'd never felt this good in her life. James. James wasn't happy when he read the note Angela had left for him. "She didn't say a word about this to me," he moaned to Tate. "She doesn't even say where she's gone, or how long she's going for," he continued. "Perhaps she doesn't know how long it will take," said Tate, trying to be helpful, and then fearing she'd said too much. "How long what will take?" said James inquiringly. Tate shrugged her shoulders, took the letter out of James's hand and started to read. "Look, it says here she'll call you once a month," she said with a hint of triumph in her voice. "Yes, but she also says that I can't question where she is and what she's doing," he replied. "You know more than you're saying, Tate," he added accusingly. "Gospel truth, I know nothing," she replied. James didn't believe her. Throughout the first month following Angela's departure, James would peer into Angela's office on a daily basis. Each time he would be disappointed. Tate wasn't much help either. She resolutely denied being in contact with Angela, which James found hard to believe. James found the latter part of the evenings the most difficult time. He took work home and often found himself working to the early hours in order to keep Angela out of his mind. He felt lonely without her, and his mind would constantly flit to happier times. She could be so much fun. In his darker moments, he would sit in the bay window looking out at the stars, sometimes cursing his fortune.
My darkness for my sun decline, violet shadows dance
On other occasions, he would think of Miles and Tate and muse how normal they were. Then he'd laugh or giggle and shake his head when he remembered how normal Miles really was. Yes, Miles defined a new meaning for the word normal. Nevertheless, James would concede that Miles had been happy to discuss Angela ad infinitum, although James was a little suspicious that some of Miles's musical creations were mirroring his relationship with her. He hadn't heard from Angela for a month. She called him in the office. He felt deliberately. She knew he'd be busy, unable to talk for long, due to disruptions from one or more of the staff. She seemed well, but he found it very hard not to cross-examine her. In fact, the conversation was extremely one-sided, as she would ask him anything, and all he could ask was, "How are you?" and a few trivial queries. James wasn't good at trivia, so the conversation seemed stilted and unnatural. He decided to try to prepare for his next conversation, which he felt sure would be only a week or so away. But when Angela called, it was almost another month that had slipped by, and her call took him by surprise. She had been gone almost 4 months when she finally called him at home and left a message for him on his answering service. James cursed his luck for not being in. He'd been at Riley's. However, she had said she'd call him back the following evening at the same time, which she did, and James subsequently felt much better. "Telephone sex?" said Miles inquiringly, observing that his friend seemed a great deal happier. James drew breath, shook his head, and changed the subject. "I knew it. I'm always right about these things," Miles claimed. "How do you live with this man?" James asked of Tate. "I really don't know sometimes," said Tate, shrugging her shoulders. Miles grinned. It was so easy to tease James. Angela did seem a little different, James conceded, but not in a bad way. After a while, everything settled down, and Riley's continued to prosper. James would see his friends 2 or 3 times a week, and Miles had asked him to be godfather to the unborn baby. It was only natural that James would celebrate his birthday with his friends at Riley's. Frank's wife would cook something special for the occasion, and Miles had even written a song, although James was dubious because Miles wouldn't tell him much about it. In fact, Miles had been so mysterious about his latest creation, James felt sure that it just had to be something rude about him, like Happy Birthday with complete word change. Still, Miles means well, even if his humour sails a bit close to the wind on occasions, thought James. Friday night at Riley's was always good, and Miles had become very adept at milking any situation at Riley's. Tonight was no exception. All of Riley's boys were there, several of the Chevalier's favourite models had turned up, and the place was buzzing. Miles leapt to the dance floor at 9 and began the Happy Birthday routine, which Miles found surprisingly unembarrassing. James even stood up and made an amusing speech about his age before starting to walk back to his table. "This is for my good friend and future godfather to our baby," said Miles, and added, "who's not yet born," in a quiet voice. As he launched into "Baby You're Back," James was tapped on the shoulder. He spun round to see Angela standing in front of him. Tate clapped her hands together. "Where have you been?" said James, barely able to control himself. "Staying close to a friend of yours," said Angela coyly. "Who's that?" said James, suddenly concerned. "Mr. Wainwright, William Wainwright. I found his card on your desk," replied Angela, smiling. "Go on, you two, dance for goodness sake," said Tate, pushing the couple towards the dance floor. "I love you," said Angela. James smiled. "I adore you," he replied.